Apparently I'm a glutton for punishment because I'm doing another video on a bird that's supposed to disprove evolution. At least this one isn't a chicken. I've skipped in a bit because the opening of the video is some very unnecessary padding mixed with cringy jokes.
2 years ago, a PhD student studying green jays spotted a photo on social media of a bird that looked kind of like a blue jay, but kind of like a green jay. And he tracked the bird down to a suburb of San Antonio, Texas, and realized it was a hybrid between the two species.
Green jays are native to parts of Central and South America. Blue jays pretty much live east of the Rockies. But due to shifts in weather patterns, the blue jays have been moving further west, and the green jays have been moving north, and now their ranges overlap in a small part of Texas.
And researchers say, we think it's the first observed vertebrate that's hybridized as a result of two species both expanding their ranges due to, at least in part, to climate change. And there it is.
But it certainly is not the first time vertebrates have been observed hybridizing, either in the wild, in the lab, or like in a zoo or farm setting.
No, the researchers actually note hybridization is probably way more common in the natural world than researchers know about because there's just so much inability to report these things happening. And it's probably possible in a lot of species that we just don't see because they're physically separated from one another, and so we don't get the chance to see them try and mate.
Well, so far there's nothing really incorrect here. There seems to have been some annoyance at the climate change point, but without any elaboration, there's no claim about science being wrong to look at. Neat looking bird.
This hybridization is actually a big problem for the evolutionary worldview. But before we get into the why, Brian, I've got a game for you.
So immediately we're doing another big skip here. The game she mentions is irrelevant to the claim about hybridization because all they do is look at pairs of animals capable of hybridization and try to guess how long ago the pairs shared a most recent common ancestor. No mention on which hybrids were able to reproduce themselves, by the way. Alright. And oop. Yeah, that should be good enough.
But so basically, in the amount of time that humans and chimps evolved from a common ancestor, these birds change so little that they can still produce offspring together. Obviously, that's utterly impossible genetically and physiologically for humans and chimps.
Yeah.
Almost like we aren't related at all.
Almost!
Current ethical boundaries and scientific experiments prevent people from doing every experiment that you could think of to test to see if humans and chimpanzees can hybridize. Despite this, comparative studies have shown for decades now that humans and chimps share 99% of DNA, once indistinct differences like insertions, sequence reversions, and sequence reading alignment are taken into account. The sheer similarity and close relation of humans and chimps evolutionarily is very well supported, and the host's implication that it isn't is wrong. As for the difference in rate of change between pairs of species discussed, the concept of evolutionary stasis, where a population of a species not encountering a great amount of environmental pressures to change, will maintain its species-defining characteristics for as long as those pressures are lacking. All the rate of evolutionary change between pairs of species tells us is which pair experienced environmental pressures sooner.
You know, this hybridizing is a big problem in the evolutionary worldview because that framework attempts to explain the origin of the species. But hybrids like this kind of force the question, like, what even is a species?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And here to discuss that with us is wildlife ecologist Jessica DeFord. Thanks for joining us, Jessica. So, when you took biology classes in college, how did they define species?
Thanks for having me on the program. In my college biology classes, a species was typically defined as a group of organisms that can reproduce to produce fertile offspring. In other words, these organisms have the ability to interbreed. For example,
Aha. There was a subtle equivocation there which I figured would come up. Remember how I mentioned that none of the hybrids in the game we skipped were noted for if they themselves could reproduce? That's a very important difference, because if two species can interbreed, but all the offspring are infertile, then there's no way for the species to have genetic material move from the population of one species to the population of the other. So even if those two species interbreed, they will still stay as separate species under the definition the guest initially gave. Let's keep that in mind for the rest of the video.
Example, with birds, a blue jay male will reproduce with a blue jay female to produce more blue jay chicks, thus increasing their population.
But there are now about 20 different definitions of species. Why is that?
There are many different definitions of species because there have been many different categories used to classify life based on man's definition. For example, variation in classification might arise because scientists study a difference or similarity in physical traits, the DNA, or even geographic location of an organism. A widely accepted criteria of the modern definition of species is that organisms that reproduce to produce viable offspring are geographically isolated, which allows for a variety of species to occur. For example, there are many species of birds, like the different types of jays we observe. We see blue jays in North America and green jays in Central America, and until recently, they have been considered geographically isolated, not able to interbreed.
Alright, let's start with what's true about what was said. Species is a fairly difficult concept to define due to some issues, hybridization being one of those. Classification of life forms is just a set of labels we make as people to help do science, after all. Phenomena like ring species show us that a population of creatures can form a continuum of individuals which can reproduce with their populations adjoining parent and daughter groups, but not with other groups that make up the continuum. These are explainable in evolutionary biology with concepts like the founder effect, where a portion of a species population which splits off from the original group geographically has a smaller variety of genetic material to propagate from, as well as a restricted gene flow, where pairings of individuals in populations over time allows for the buildup of genetic differences such that two subgroups of the initial population become incapable of interbreeding. In the latter case, the original species is represented by individuals which can reproduce with either daughter species to make hybrids. That's a lot different from how many people usually think of hybrids, but they are included. Now as for what's wrong with what the guest said. As far as my research tells me, it's incorrect to say that two populations geographically isolated which otherwise would be able to interbreed and make offspring which is not indistinguishable from either population are considered different species. The brown rat doesn't become a new species of animal just by island hopping. Speciation requires a difference of characteristics between the full populations of a creature, not merely geographic isolation. I would also like to nitpick on the usage of the phrase man's definition, because the Bible doesn't contain a literal definition of a species, and so any definition derived from it is going to be the work of a human being. Anyway, enough rambling.
So how do hybrids like this new blue-green grue jay challenge the evolutionary model for the origin of species?
Hybrids like the blue-green jay challenge evolution because scientists would not expect these geographically isolated jays to interbreed and produce a hybrid like the one observed in Texas.
Now, the researchers even note that this is a big surprise, especially considering they've supposedly been separated for 7 million years. That is an enormous amount of time for them to still be so similar that they're able to interbreed. But we really shouldn't be surprised that our man-made system of classification really struggles to accurately reflect what we observe, because God didn't create life according to their species, but rather according to their kind. So
oh, come on. The creationist concept of a kind is way less definable than a species. Various attempts by creationists to use scientific methods to define a kind have never gotten a result that manages to split humans off from the rest of the great apes, which didn't either reduce kind to be the same as species, or was invalid because they were comparing apples to oranges data-wise. I could be optimistic and expect them to provide an actual solid definition of kind here. Well, go ahead, disappoint me again.
Jessica, what is the difference between species and kind?
In God's word, we see the Hebrew word min, which means kind. God's word tells us that God created plants and animals according to their kinds. This is repeated over and over again in Genesis, which means that God created animal kinds that reproduce within their kind and do not change from one kind to another. Because of the genetic diversity God placed within those kinds, we might see variation. This variation is often why scientists would categorize animals as different species. For example, classifying a blue jay and a green jay as separate species because they fit the modern definition of a species. They are considered two different groups of organisms that reproduce to produce viable offspring. Blue jays reproducing with blue jays to produce more blue jays, and green jays reproducing with green jays to produce more green jays, even though these jays are part of the same biblical kind, the corvid or crow kind.
Oh, they're defining kind as a family, huh? That's interesting, given that the hominid family groups humans as a great ape, but earlier the hosts were waving their incredulity about the similarity of humans and chimpanzees around. Does that mean they accept our common ancestry with other great apes?
A tongue twister. Good job spelling all that out for us, right? And in a biblical worldview of kinds, these hybrids really are no surprise. They're part of the same kind and only separated by a few thousands of years at most. So while some people might think this grue jay is evolution in action or something like that, it's really a confirmation of what we expect starting with God's word. Isn't that right?
Because they are part of the same biblical kind, they can reproduce and produce a hybrid species. Therefore, a blue-green jay hybrid is consistent with God's word and confirms God creating plants and animals according to their kinds.
Thanks so much for joining us, Jessica.
Well, that's very nice that this hybrid animal works with their concept, but it doesn't disprove evolution. The hybrid going from their reporting was also an accidental discovery, so it wasn't a prediction of theirs. Cool bird, but a rather moot discussion on the evidence for evolution. Glad to see Answers in Genesis accepts that humans and chimps are part of the same kind, though.